Measures to secure medium to long-term flexibility in electricity markets by Tim Schittekatte, Senior Director at FTI Consulting and researcher at MIT, and Carson, Senior Director at FTI Consulting. Unfortunately, Tim Schittekatte could not join us in person today, but he has prepared a video presentation for us. Let's watch the video first. Please give a big round of applause.
Good afternoon in Seoul. Thank you very much for having me. Unfortunately, I could not be there in person, but luckily my colleague Carson is there. So my name is Tim Schittekatte. I'm a Senior Director at FTI Consulting in London. I'm also a research affiliate at the MIT Energy Initiative, where I was previously based, and a part-time assistant professor at the Florence School of Regulation. And today with my colleague Carson, we'll talk to you about global trends and measures to secure mid to long-term flexibility in the electricity market, which is an extremely topical issue. So first, to set the scene, most of you might already be aware, but it's good to repeat, is that all across the globe, at least in most developed countries, there have been very ambitious carbon neutrality targets set. And those targets basically imply a strategy of those countries that consists out of two parts. First, it means electrify as much as you can. On the right, you can see graphs from the International Energy Agency, the electrification expected in buildings, transport, and industry. And at the same time, decarbonize the electricity grid, which means invest and install as much as possible renewables, most particularly solar and wind. On the right, you can see graphs from the United States on the capacity additions to the power system in the last couple of years. And you can see that already today, the most important capacities that are added to the grid are wind and solar resources, as well more recently batteries, so lithium-ion batteries. So what we'll talk about today is three challenges that come with the decarbonization of the power grid. First, we'll highlight power prices, which indicate or signal that need for flexibility, but also show how uncertainty has been increasing. Second, the role of capacity remuneration mechanisms, which are basically mechanisms that act as complements to electricity wholesale markets in order to stimulate new investment into flexible and firm capacity or avoid capacity that could be valuable to exit the market. Third, we'll talk about the need to increasingly reflect networks into or network constraints into the electricity market in order to give indications of where to invest in those firm or flexible resources and how to operate them most efficiently. Because investing into those resources is not enough. You also need to operate them as efficiently as possible, and that's what you do with a proper electricity market design. So first, power prices. So all across the world, where we see renewables increasing, we see important impacts onto power prices. Here you can see three dynamics and three examples from across the globe. First example is that power price volatility or the volatility of power price patterns increases massively. This is an example from Australia where you can see during noon prices are very low. In the evening, prices get very high. This is the same in California, in Spain, all across the globe with more and more renewables, but also with more wind, which basically shows the value of being very flexible in your consumption and being flexible in your generation, basically being there when the system needs you the most, meaning early evenings in those systems. What you can also see is scarcity prices in Texas. That's the middle graph. So in those highly renewable systems, prices are often very low, but sometimes prices are spiking. They're really, really high. And during those moments is when the system is stressed. There's not enough capacity while there is a high demand. So a lot of those flexible resources, basically they will earn their revenues only, or at least a large part of their revenues, only in a few hours when they really need it, which is something that complicates the business case. So even though they're very valuable, it becomes a very risky investment. On the third graph, what you can see is the amount of very low or even negative priced hours. So last year in many European countries, more than 100 of hours prices were actually negative when you have an excess of production that is not met with enough demand, which shows a lack of sort of demand response. It also shows an actual mismatch of renewable supply and generation, which creates issues with business cases, for example, for baseload. Because baseload, for example, nuclear, they cannot switch off, and then they have to pay those very negative prices just to remain generating, which of course creates issues. So all this prices, what it shows is flexibility is increasingly required, but uncertainty is also very much increased, which creates issues with investment. And that's why you see the growth of capacity remuneration mechanisms to sort of complement the electricity wholesale revenues and make sure we have enough investment into the capacity that we need. So what it basically means in practice is often it's a system operator or a government who looks ahead 3 or 4 years and thinks, will I have enough investment into power generation or storage to meet my expected demand? And if not, I will organize capacity market to make sure that I will have that investment or that enough installed of capacity. In theory, for the longest time in academia, it was argued that you don't need capacity remuneration mechanisms, that there's enough revenue in the electricity wholesale market in order to stimulate investment. But as we know, in practice, electricity markets are not perfect. Sometimes the revenues are dampened, for example, by price caps or market power. But even if electricity markets are perfect or the wholesale market design is perfect, they might still be a lack of hedging instruments or counterparties to sign long-term deal with. So there are certain issues with uncertainty that cannot be covered by long-term contracts. And therefore, there's an argument to have those capacity mechanisms in place that then stimulate that investment. And that is what we have seen all across the globe. Here you can see a picture of the capacity remuneration mechanisms in Europe and in the US. In the US, all the ISOs other than ERCOT, they have a capacity remuneration mechanism in place. In Europe, most of the countries, they do have a capacity remuneration mechanism, and increasingly so. That map looked a bit different a couple of years ago, so it's increasing over time. You can also see that there are specific types of capacity mechanisms. So there's a capacity market, there's capacity payments, there's capacity requirements, there's strategic reserves. They go really, really into the nitty-gritty of those or we won't go into the nitty-gritty of those designs today, but you can always write me an email or ask me a question during the Q&A. I've been working in many of those different markets. What we'll do is to just sort of exemplify 3 approaches. So there's the centralized capacity mechanism or market in the UK. What it is an auction where the system operator will set the demand, which is the required capacity it wants to see in the future in, let's say, 3 or 4 years. And then everybody will bid in that centralized auction, the ones who have existing capacity and the ones who want to build new capacity. And then that market will clear and you'll have a price that is then paid out to the resources that are awarded in that centralized auction. Of course, the value of 1 megawatt of solar is not the same, for example, than the value of 1 megawatt of gas. So there's derating factors to account for that. So the advantage is that you can have lots of competition. It's quite transparent, but it might also be a very costly mechanism because you basically pay everybody who has available capacity. In Germany, a different approach was applied. There was a strategic reserve for the longest time, which means a procurement of a small amount of capacity, strategic capacity that otherwise would have gone out of the market or would have gone retired. But the German TSOs then pay that capacity to remain ready from when there is a certain situation. Those capacity gets called upon when there is a certain stress situation. But in normal times, that capacity is not active into the energy market. Recently, the German government has decided to introduce a new capacity mechanism that is a sort of a mix between the one that is applied in GB and the one that is applied in California. In California, there's a decentralized capacity remuneration mechanism. What that means is that at central level, the regulator decides, okay, each load serving entity has to procure capacity, 115% of its expected capacity it needs to procure. But how it does, it's up to that load serving entity, which can be different areas within California that then build their own capacity, do bilateral deals, or organize their own local auction. There's more flexibility in that approach on how to reach the necessary capacity, but it can also be a bit less transparent. So each of those countries has their own approaches and their own context. And this is just a flavor of how complicated that design can be. For your reference, there's also a taxonomy into the slides, but I won't go into the details right now. Now over to Carson.
네, 좋은 강연 해주신
Thank you so much, Team Schittekatte. As he already said, we would like to invite Carson Shu, Director at FTI Consulting, for his part of the presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, please give him a big round of applause.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I will now speak about the third part of our presentation, how to reflect network constraints in electricity market design. Specifically, I will be talking about the topic of locational pricing. So what is locational pricing? Locational pricing is about creating price areas within an electricity market where the electricity price can be different in each area. Usually, we talk about two different types. One is zonal pricing, where you have relatively large price areas, for example, 6 or 7 in a country. And nodal pricing is where you have much smaller areas, so you may have perhaps a few hundred. As you can see on the slide, over time, more and more liberalized electricity markets are moving away from single national prices to zonal or nodal pricing. And part of the reason is because this market design helps facilitate more efficient investment and more efficient operation. As Tim said at the beginning of our presentation, investing in thermal flexible capacity resources by itself is not enough. We also want to invest those resources in the right places, and we want to operate them as efficiently as possible, and the proper market design can help us to do this. I will now illustrate how this works by talking about the case study of the GB electricity market in the UK. So currently, the UK electricity system has a single national price with much more generation capacity in the north of the country, in Scotland, whilst demand is more concentrated in the south, in England and around the capital city of London. This creates pressure on the transmission network to transport electricity north to south, and does lead to a curtailment where the system operator has to pay generators to stop producing power because there are constraints on the transmission network that restrict the amount of power that can be moved around the system. Ideally, it could be more efficient for generation to be located closer to where demand is more concentrated. So in this context, the UK authorities are currently considering proposals for locational pricing. And on the left of the slide, you can see the current single market design. And you can also see in the middle the proposal for zonal markets with 7 zones. And on the right, you can see the proposal for nodal pricing with around 850 nodes. So all of these proposals are expected to have a number of effects, and they're currently being studied in great detail by the UK authorities. And I'll just give a flavor of those right now. First, and most obviously, it's expected that locational pricing will lead to variations in electricity prices across the country. And this could impact, of course, customer bills and generator revenues. You can see in the slide deck, we've included some results of simulation modeling carried out by FTI Consulting. But in general, what you would expect under locational pricing is that there'll be higher prices in the south and lower prices in the north compared to a market with a single national price, reflecting the supply and demand conditions around the country. So I'll just go back to the effects. So this is expected to send signals for generation to be built in different places. In general, you may expect there to be more capacity built in the southern parts of the country, where electricity prices are expected to be higher, and that could alleviate some of the current transmission constraints between north and south. This could also lead to lower costs of system operation, because of course the system operator does not have to pay generators as much to stop producing power, because the power itself is already being built and produced closer to where the demand is in the first place. This could also lead to reduced carbon emissions, because of course if renewables are curtailed less, then more demand can be served without using more carbon-intensive thermal generation, such as gas. Finally, it could also lead to better use of other flexible assets, such as interconnectors and storage. And just to give you a simple example, a more localized electricity price could send a stronger signal to a battery or an electric vehicle about when to charge or discharge according to the needs of the network where they are. So a range of potential impacts on investment signals and operation. I should mention that FTI Consulting are involved in working with the UK authorities on studying all of this, and we're happy to answer more detailed questions in the Q&A. Okay, at this point, I will stop talking about location pricing and just say that there are actually many other topics that we could have spoken about today related to the topic of mid to long-term flexibility. We've set out some topics on this slide, but I will highlight just 3 for now. The first is interconnection between different countries' electric systems to allow for trading of electricity. This is very common in Europe, and increasingly we're seeing interest in the Asia region for the development of such projects. Secondly, I'll just mention hydrogen. There's a very lively debate around what its role will be in the energy transition all over the world, and the debate varies between countries. And finally, I'll mention distributed energy resources, and I'll just say that there are some very interesting examples. For example, Australia, where there is a large quantity of rooftop solar, but this, of course, creates its own challenges around managing the distribution network. At this point, I'll end my presentation, and I'll say thank you very much for listening. That concludes, and we're very happy to take any questions you may have.
네, 발표해 주신
Thank you so much, Mr. Carson Su. Yes, we had 2 senior directors at FTI Consulting, and it seems like you have paid a closer attention to these 2 speakers, so you may have some questions. And then if you have any questions, please ask the questions to first Team Schittekatte, followed by Carson Su. Okay, so Team Schittekatte is online.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you perfectly.
Yes. 감사합니다.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you. 여러분들 혹시 질문 있으신 분 있으시면
Do you have any questions to Tim Schittekatte or Carson Su? If you have any questions, we are going to hand over the microphone to you. Do you have any questions regarding the presentation? No? Okay, then can I move on? Okay, got it. The simultaneous interpreting is being provided, so if you have any questions, just feel free and ask the question in the language of your choice. The simultaneous translation is providing, and Senior Director Tim Schittekatte is online, so okay, over there, we are going to hand over the microphone. Good afternoon. Hello. In your presentation, you mentioned the decarbonization of the electricity grid, and you actually mentioned the 3 challenges, and one of them is pricing. Renewable energy is emerging, and the fluctuation of the price is increasing as well. With that volatility and fluctuations, we have to, the demand and the consumption should be more responsive. And do we need any infrastructures or regulations or policies? What kind of policies you can think of to be more responsive to this renewable energy increase?
Yes, thank you very much for your question. I hope you can hear me well. So I think the number 1 policy for demand to be more active is measures in the retail market, and the availability of contracts for consumers or at least smaller users to reflect that electricity price volatility. And those contracts, it depends on where you look in the world, are quite popular. For example, in the Nordics, Norway, Denmark, there's already, like Norway, 80-90% of consumers that see that they had price volatility. Spain as well, 50%. There are other countries like Germany, where it's 0% of consumers, so you need a smart meter, and you need retailers who are willing to offer those contracts. So that's a good thing, because it means that some consumers will see that volatility, react to it. Of course, you need locational pricing, because otherwise you might react against the network, because your price signal is not granular enough. But the disadvantage of that is that sometimes this price volatility also works against the consumer, because suddenly from 1 month to another, or from 1 hour to another, in the case of Texas, for example, prices can be very large. And if consumer is not very much aware, you'll get a lot of political resistance. That's what we've seen in the storm during Uri in 2021 in February in Texas, where now that type of pricing is not allowed anymore. That's what we've seen in the European energy crisis, where suddenly consumers on those contracts were the first consumers who saw that gas prices were rising, and there was a lot of political opposition. So you need to send those volatile price signals while at the same time protect consumers against that sort of volatility. So therefore you need innovative solutions like hedging or sort of insurance contracts on top of sending those volatile price signals. And there's a lot of work around the world to improve that, but we're not there yet. There's some good examples in Europe. US is a little behind in that aspect. Thank you.
네, 답변이 되셨을까요?
Was it answered? Was your question answered? Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Please hand over the microphone. Okay. Once he gets the microphone, he's gonna speak. Okay, on the second row.
Kim, I'm an assistant professor at Kentech. I have one question each for Team and Carson, actually. So for Team, so when we have more and more capacity remuneration policies, for example, capacity payment and capacity market and so on, then what would be the meaning of the spot market? Like it automatically changes the strategy for the stakeholders, right? They can be at a different price when they have more remuneration policies for the capacity, then what will be the function of the spot market? That's my question.
Yes, thank you very much for your question. I think a capacity market is a little bit addictive, because the moment you have a capacity market, probably the prices in the wholesale market will be generally a bit lower, because you already receive that revenue via the capacity market. So then these prices are lower, which makes the case for the capacity market to remain even stronger. So that's a bit of a slippery slope that we have seen in quite some countries. But the role of the spot market remains incredibly important in sending the right operational signals, which is something that is absolutely not done by a capacity mechanism that only pays you for being there, especially when you need it. And a spot market is then a complement, or they're complementing to each other, because when the spot prices are high, that is actually the signal when those resources that are procured via the capacity market should really be there. So there's mechanisms like reliability options, which have been in place in Colombia for the longest time, ISO New England, Italy now, Belgium, that basically say, okay, the ones that are procured in the capacity market, we're gonna trigger you, or you're really gonna have to pay lots of money when you're not there, when the spot price is above a certain level. So it's a sort of option contract. So in that sense, the spot market is the measuring of the temperature of the system, and then it's a way to link with the capacity mechanism. But you absolutely need it to figure out when to charge your batteries, when to have that demand response. For renewables as well, like as Carson said, the spot market will indicate where those renewables are more valuable, so they're sending signals and then working in tandem with the capacity market. So in the terms of operation, it remains, and sending those locational signals and sort of what types of resources you need, it remains incredibly important.
Okay, thank you. And for Carson, I'm actually having a question regarding the how to calculate how to allocate the congestion surplus in your study. So when we introduce, say, either zonal pricing or the nodal pricing, we always have this congestion surplus, right? So in your study, how do you allocate that? Do you allocate that based on the auction mechanism, just like FTR? Or do you allocate for the, say, transmission projects and so on? Like, how do you allocate that?
Yeah, so I'll say a few words on that, but I'm sure Tim can jump in as well. I think in our cost-benefit analysis, we allocated it just across the whole country. We didn't necessarily do a zone-by-zone cost-benefit analysis. There are, of course, ways to do this. There are sort of economic ways, such as benefits relative to each zone, and of course there are other ways, say 50-50, right? And I think, it just depends on the assumptions you take. But primarily in our work, I think we were doing a national study, so it was less important to allocate it before zones. But happy to discuss further if that's of interest.
Yeah, and then the small. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's the revenue of the intra-GB congestion rents, right? So these are allocated to the load. And that's a choice, it's a policy choice. Like Carson says, you can do it differently. You can do it 50-50 or so. But all across the world, I mean, ideally the load is paying for transmission. So that income from this revenue should be allocated to the load. But there's a lot of discussion right now is, okay, when you go to locational pricing, some generators will be losing out money, especially the ones like Carson showed in the north, they see lower prices. So there is a case to allocate part of those congestion rents, at least temporarily, to those generators to compensate them for that loss, which is basically a transfer or a temporary transfer from consumer to producers to make them agree on that policy change. That's what we call grandfathering. And it's something that also in the US has been discussed a lot when they went from their zonal systems, in some cases, like Texas and California, to the nodal systems.
And one small follow-up question regarding how to set the, how to settle the market for the nodal pricing. So when we solve this GET problem for having the dispatch results out of it and calculate the dual fold, calculating all the pricing, how do you set the upper bound for the transmission lines? Because currently in Korea, we're also considering introducing the either zonal pricing or the nodal pricing, but one of the big issues is that how to set the upper bound. We carry out the contingency analysis, right? And then probably we can set the upper bound based on that contingency analysis, but oftentimes those contingency analysis have multiple solutions to maintain the stability, right? So I was wondering first, how to set those upper bound, and second, in what degree what information is shared among the stakeholders when all the participants need to predict the price in the nodal pricing or the zonal pricing?
Yes, Carson, do I go? So I think it's a lot easier in a nodal system that those sort of questions on how do you represent the actual physical limits of your network into the market. Because in the nodal system, you're basically doing that contingency analysis, or you're doing at least a sort of very advanced DC power flow and in real-time AC power flow within your market clearing to consider all those elements. But of course, things like stability or voltage to a certain extent you don't consider, and then it's sort of the control room, the system operator who has good experience with sort of how can you adjust manually or via all sort of programs these limits to avoid those issues that are then not covered in the market clearing, but it does cover quite a lot because it's the SCED. So that sort of setting of the limits is not necessarily a big issue that I'm aware of in the nodal pricing, but it is a much harder under zonal pricing, especially when you do it the European way, because then you have to basically abstract an actual network into a capacity, one number that you can allow trade between the different zones. So that abstraction is really hard. And there they have been using what they call net transfer capacity approach and now flow-based approach that sort of improves the way of mapping sort of all those technical information, all those contingency scenario into allowing a certain volume that can be traded between a border, which is actually not a real electrical border, it's a financial border, right? Because you need to abstract that in that zonal system. And I think we can talk about this for many days, and happy to do so, on how to exactly do that. And there's been a lot of experiments with that, but nodal pricing is easier because it's closer to the physical system than zonal pricing. In that physical representation, right? That's just one of the many dimensions to cover.
Okay, thank you so much.
네, thank you for your answer. 네, Mr. Schittekatte and Shu-님.
Thank you so much. Any other questions to Maybe Carson Shu? Okay, we are a little behind the schedule, so let me wrap up the session. Thank you so much for your answers, ladies and gentlemen. Please give them a big round of applause. That was really the passionate debate and discussions, and thank you so much for your active participation.